12-year-old Marcus Chen lives with his single mother Sarah in a modest apartment in suburban Denver, Colorado. Despite their financial struggles, Marcus is a brilliant student, passionate about science. When the annual school science fair approaches, Marcus works tirelessly on his project about renewable energy. However, on the day of the fair, classmates mock his worn-out sneakers, causing deep embarrassment. Just when things seem hopeless, his godfather, Jake "the Thunder" Rodriguez, a professional UFC fighter he hasn't seen in years, unexpectedly arrives at the school, teaching everyone powerful lessons about respect, resilience, and true worth. The preparation. The October morning air in Denver carried the crisp promise of winter as 12-year-old Marcus Chen carefully placed his science project into a cardboard box. His small hands trembled slightly, not from the cold seeping through the thin walls of their apartment, but from excitement mixed with anxiety. "Mom, does this look professional enough?" Marcus asked, adjusting the small wind turbine he'd built from recycled materials and spare electronics. Sarah Chen looked up from the kitchen table where she was sorting through bills, her tired eyes softening as she watched her son. At 34, she looked older than her years, the result of working double shifts at the local diner while raising Marcus alone since his father left when he was 3. "It looks amazing, sweetheart," she said, genuinely impressed by the intricate model that demonstrated how wind could generate electricity to power LED lights. "You've been working on this for months." Marcus beamed with pride. The Jefferson Middle School Science Fair was today, and he'd poured his heart into this project. He'd spent countless evenings at the public library, researching renewable energy, watching YouTube tutorials on his old tablet, and carefully assembling each component. "Mrs. Patterson says the winning project might get featured in the district newsletter," Marcus said, his dark eyes sparkling with hope. "And there's a $50 prize." Sarah's smile faltered slightly at the mention of money. $50 would buy groceries for a week. She glanced down at Marcus's feet and felt her heart sink. His sneakers, once white but now a dingy grey, had holes near the big toes that she'd tried to hide with duct tape. The soles were separating, held together by determination and prayer. "Marcus, honey," she said gently, "maybe we should—" "I know what you're thinking, Mom," Marcus interrupted, looking down at his shoes. "But it's okay. Nobody's going to be looking at my feet. They'll be looking at my project." Sarah wanted to drive to the nearest store and buy him new shoes, but her checking account had $12 until Friday's paycheck. She'd already borrowed from her emergency fund to buy materials for his science project. "You're right," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "Your brilliant mind is what matters." As they drove to school in their 15-year-old Honda Civic, the heater broken, windows slightly fogged, Marcus practiced his presentation. He'd memorized every detail about wind energy conversion, environmental impact, and cost-effectiveness. His passion was infectious, and Sarah found herself smiling despite her worries. "Remember when Uncle Jake used to say that?" Marcus said suddenly. "Say what, honey?" "That it's not what you wear, it's how you fight. He always said clothes don't make the warrior." Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Jake Rodriguez hadn't been around in 3 years, not since he'd gotten his big UFC contract and moved to Las Vegas. He'd been Marcus's godfather since birth, her late husband's best friend, and once promised to always be there for Marcus. But fame and fortune had a way of changing people. "That sounds like something Jake would say," she admitted softly. "Do you think he'll ever visit again?" Marcus asked, his voice smaller now. "I don't know, baby. He's living a very different life now." They pulled into the school parking lot, and Marcus carefully lifted his project box. Through the windows of Jefferson Middle School they could see other students arriving with their parents, many carrying elaborate display boards and sophisticated-looking experiments. "Wow," Marcus whispered, watching a classmate named Trevor Sullivan being helped by both parents as they wheeled in what appeared to be a fully functional robotic arm. Trevor's father wore an expensive suit, and Trevor himself sported brand new Jordan sneakers that probably cost more than Sarah made in a week. "Don't compare, Marcus," Sarah said, reading his expression. "Your project is just as good. You did all the work yourself." As they walked toward the school entrance, Marcus noticed other students' outfits. Crisp button-down shirts, new jeans, pristine sneakers. He suddenly became acutely aware of his own worn jeans, hand-me-downs from a neighbor, and the faded science club t-shirt he'd gotten for free last year. But most of all, he became aware of his shoes. "Mom," he said quietly as they reached the doors, "maybe I should have stayed home sick today." Sarah knelt down to his eye level, right there on the sidewalk, not caring who might see. "Marcus Chen, you listen to me. You are brilliant, hard-working, and kind. You built something amazing with your own hands and your own mind. That matters more than anything else. But what if they laugh? Then they're showing their ignorance, not yours. You hold your head high in there, okay?" Marcus nodded, though the knot in his stomach remained. He didn't know that in a few hours he'd need every ounce of that advice, and that help would come from a source he never expected. As they entered the bustling hallway filled with the excited chatter of students and parents preparing for the science fair, Marcus gripped his project box tighter and tried to focus on the pride in his work, rather than the fear gnawing at his confidence. The day that would change everything was just beginning. The humiliation. The Jefferson Middle School gymnasium buzzed with activity as students set up their science fair displays. Colorful trifold boards lined long tables, creating a maze of projects ranging from volcano demonstrations to sophisticated computer programs. The smell of poster paint and markers mixed with the excited energy of parents wielding cameras and smartphones. Marcus found his assigned table, number 47, near the back corner of the gym. He tried not to feel disappointed about the location as he carefully unpacked his wind energy project. The small turbine looked modest compared to some of the elaborate displays around him, but when he connected the battery and the LED lights flickered to life, powered by the gentle rotation of his handmade blades, he felt a surge of pride. "Okay, baby, I have to get to work," Sarah said, checking her phone. "The lunch rush starts in an hour. Text me how it goes, okay?" "You're not staying for the judging?" Marcus asked, trying to hide his disappointment. "I wish I could, sweetheart. Mrs. Rodriguez called in sick, so I'm covering a double. But I know you're going to do amazing." She kissed his forehead and squeezed his shoulders. "Remember what we talked about? Head high." Marcus watched his mother leave, her diner uniform visible under her thin jacket. He turned back to his display, adjusting his presentation cards and practicing his speech under his breath. "Renewable energy is the future of our planet," he murmured. "Wine power is clean, efficient, and oh my God, check out those shoes." The voice belonged to Brittany Morrison, one of the popular 8th graders whose father owned several car dealerships around Denver. She was pointing directly at Marcus's feet, her perfectly manicured finger adorned with rings that probably cost more than his family's monthly grocery budget. Marcus felt his cheeks burn as a small group gathered around Brittany. Trevor Sullivan, the boy with the robotic arm project, laughed so hard he snorted. "Dude, are those held together with duct tape?" Trevor asked loudly, causing more heads to turn. "What is this 1995? "Maybe he's going for the homeless chic look," added Madison Parker, Brittany's best friend. She was holding the latest iPhone in a bedazzled case. "Is this like performance art or something?" Marcus looked down at his feet, wishing he could disappear into the gymnasium floor. The duct tape on his left shoe had started to peel, making the hole more visible. His face felt like it was on fire. "Leave him alone," said a quiet voice. Emma Rodriguez, no relation to Jake, despite the shared last name, stood at the table next to his, with a project about water purification. She was one of the few students who'd ever been kind to Marcus. "Oh, please, Emma." Brittany rolled her eyes. We're not being mean. We're just concerned. I mean, my mom always says presentation matters in science. How can the judges take him seriously looking like that? More students began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Marcus felt trapped behind his table, his escape, routes blocked by the growing crowd of curious faces. Some looked sympathetic, but others were clearly entertained by the spectacle. I heard his mom works at that gross diner on Colfax, whispered Jake Peterson. My dad says they have health code violations. That explains the fashion sense, Trevor chimed in, and several kids laughed. Marcus gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles white. He wanted to defend his mother, to tell them she worked harder than any of their parents, that she'd sacrificed new clothes for herself so he could have materials for his project. But the words stuck in his throat like concrete. Hey, Marcus, Brittany said with fake sweetness, did you walk here? Because I don't see how those shoes could survive a car ride without falling apart completely. The laughter grew louder. Marcus noticed even some of the adults were looking over now, drawn by the noise. Mrs. Patterson, the science teacher, was across the gym, helping another student, oblivious to what was happening. You know what's really sad? Madison added, pulling out her phone. I bet these shoes have never even been in a real store. Probably came from Goodwill or something. Or a dumpster, someone called out from the back of the group. Marcus felt tears, threatening to spill. He looked at his wind turbine, still spinning quietly, its LED lights blinking in a pattern he'd programmed to be as efficient as possible. All those hours of work, all that research and creativity, and nobody was seeing any of it. They only saw his poverty. At least tell me you have better shoes at home, Trevor said, now filming with his phone. Like, please tell me these aren't your only pair. The truth was, they were his only pair of sneakers. He had church shoes, black dress shoes that were also second-hand but in slightly better condition. But those weren't appropriate for school. Marcus stammered, his voice barely audible. What was that? Brittany cupped her ear dramatically. Did you say something, or are you too embarrassed to talk? Emma stepped forward. Seriously, just stop. This is mean. Mean? We're just asking questions, Madison said innocently. I mean, if he's going to come to school looking like that, people are going to notice. We're actually doing him a favor by telling him. Marcus felt the walls of the gymnasium closing in. The bright fluorescent lights seemed too harsh, the voices too loud. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, drowning out almost everything else. You want to know something funny? Trevor said, getting bolder as his video gained viewers who were live streaming to other students. I bet those shoes cost more to fix with duct tape than they were worth in the first place. At least he's environmentally conscious, laughed another voice. Reduce, reuse, recycle, right, Marcus? The crowd erupted in laughter. Marcus closed his eyes, wishing he could transport himself anywhere else, back to his apartment, to the library where he'd researched his project, even to his mother's diner where at least people respected hard work. Hey, Emma said firmly, why don't you all go back to your own projects? The judges are going to start making rounds soon. Fine, Brittany shrugged. But seriously, Marcus, next time maybe ask for some fashion advice. There are programs that help people like you. As the crowd began to disperse, still chuckling and whispering, Marcus opened his eyes. His vision was blurry with unshed tears and his hands were shaking. He looked at his beautiful project, the culmination of months of work and dreams. And for the first time it seemed small and inadequate. Emma approached his table. Don't listen to them, she said softly. Your project is really cool. I saw it working earlier. Marcus managed a weak smile. Thanks, but it doesn't matter. They're right about how I look. No, they're not. They're just bullies with too much money and too little character. But Marcus could barely hear her over. The ringing in his ears and the voice in his head that kept repeating what he'd just experienced. He looked around the gymnasium at all the polished displays, the confident students in their name-brand clothes, The proud parents with their expensive cameras. He didn't belong here. He'd been foolish to think he ever did. What Marcus didn't know was that at that very moment, someone was walking through the front doors of Jefferson Middle School. Someone who would change everything about this day and teach everyone present a lesson they'd never forget. The arrival, Jake the Thunder. Rodriguez stood in the main hallway of Jefferson Middle School, his 6'2" frame filling the doorway as he studied the signs directing visitors to the science fair. He wore dark jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and a leather jacket, unremarkable clothes that somehow looked different on him because of the way he carried himself. The confidence of someone who'd fought in front of millions, who'd faced down opponents who wanted to break him, and who'd never backed down from a challenge. But it wasn't his clothes that would command attention. It was what he carried in his right hand, his UFC championship belt, gleaming gold and black, still smelling faintly of the Las Vegas arena where he'd won it just 6 weeks ago. Jake had been driving through Denver on his way to a training camp in Colorado Springs when he'd gotten a text that made him slam on the brakes and turn around. It wasn't from Sarah. They hadn't spoken in months. It was from Emma Rodriguez, a 12-year-old girl who'd somehow found his Instagram and sent him a direct message that read, "Your godson Marcus is getting bullied at school right now. Jefferson Middle Science Fair. He needs you." Jake didn't know Emma, didn't know how she'd connected him to Marcus, and didn't question whether the message was real. He just knew that 3 years ago, he'd promised his dying best friend that he'd always look out for Marcus. And lately, he'd been failing. At that promise spectacularly, fame had been intoxicating at first. The money, the recognition, the opportunities. But somewhere along the way, he'd lost sight of what mattered. He'd stopped calling Sarah and Marcus, telling himself he was too busy, that they were better off without the complications of his high-profile life. He'd convinced himself that sending the occasional gift or money was enough, but Emma's message had shattered that delusion in an instant. As Jake walked toward the gymnasium, he could hear the familiar sounds of a school event. Excited, chatter, adult voices giving directions, the squeak of sneakers on polished floors. It reminded him of his own childhood in East LA, where he'd grown up poor and angry until sports gave him direction, and Marcus's father, David Chen, gave him friendship. The gymnasium doors were propped open, and Jake could see the colorful displays of the science fair spread out before him. Parents milled around with cameras, students stood nervously by their projects, and teachers moved between tables with clipboards and judging sheets. Jake scanned the room, looking for Marcus. It had been 3 years since he'd seen his godson, and he wasn't sure he'd recognize him immediately. But then he heard the laughter, the cruel kind that he remembered too well from his own school days, and followed the sound to the back corner of the gym. What he saw made his jaw clench and his hands tighten into fists. A group of well-dressed kids surrounded a table where a small Asian boy stood alone, his head down, his shoulders hunched in defeat. Even from a distance, Jake could see the duct tape on the boy's shoes and the way he seemed to shrink in on himself as the other kids laughed and pointed. Marcus, his godson, David's son. Jake had seen a lot of bullying in his life, had experienced it himself and had witnessed it in gyms and training camps around the world. But seeing it happen to Marcus, to the sweet little boy he'd once pushed on swings and taught to throw a baseball, ignited something primal in him. He began walking toward the group, his fighter's instincts kicking in. His stride was measured, purposeful, the walk of someone who'd never met a problem he couldn't handle. As he got closer, he could hear the words being thrown at Marcus. "Probably got those shoes from a garbage dump. Can't believe he thought he could compete with us. Maybe someone should call social services." Jake stepped into the circle of students just as a blonde girl was saying something about people like you to Marcus. The conversation stopped abruptly as the teenagers became aware of the imposing figure who'd suddenly appeared among them. "Is there a problem here?" Jake asked. his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. The students looked up at him, way up, since most of them barely reached his chest. Trevor Sullivan, who'd been filming on his phone, slowly lowered the device as he took in Jake's muscular frame and the dangerous calm in his dark eyes. No, sir," Brittany stammered, suddenly looking much younger than her 13 years. "We were just talking." "Talking," Jake repeated, his gaze moving slowly from face to face. "About what exactly?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Marcus looked up for the first time, his eyes widening in disbelief when he saw who was standing. "There, Uncle Jake," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Jake's expression softened immediately as he looked at his godson. The boy was taller now, his face more angular, but his eyes, David's eyes, were exactly the same. Except now they were filled with hurt and embarrassment instead of the wonder Jake remembered. "Hey there, champion," Jake said gently, stepping through the circle to stand beside Marcus. He placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "Sorry I'm late." "But how did you?" Marcus began. "Someone sent me a message," Jake said, glancing at Emma Rodriguez, who was watching from the next table with a small smile. "Told me my godson needed backup." He turned back to the group of students, who were now shifting nervously and exchanging uncertain glances. The championship belt in his left hand caught the gymnasium lights, impossible to miss. "Now," Jake continued, his voice returning to that calm, dangerous tone, "I want to understand what was happening here before I arrived. Because from what I heard walking up, it sounded like a group of kids were making fun of someone for being poor." "We weren't," Trevor started. "I wasn't talking to you," Jake interrupted, his gaze never leaving the boy's face. "I was making an observation. See, I grew up poor too. Holes in my shoes, duct tape holding my backpack together, wearing the same clothes 3 days in a row, because they were the only ones I had." He paused, letting that sink in. "You want to know something interesting about being poor?" Jake continued. "It teaches you things that money can't buy. It teaches you to be resourceful, to work harder than everyone else, to never give up, no matter how many people tell you that you don't belong." Brittany was now looking at her designer shoes, and Madison had put her phone away entirely. "More importantly," Jake said, lifting the UFC championship belt so everyone could see it clearly, "it teaches you to recognize real strength when you see it. And real strength isn't about what you wear or what your parents drive or how much money you have." He looked down at Marcus's science project, the modest wind turbine still spinning quietly, still powering its LED lights with elegant efficiency. "Real strength," Jake continued, "is working for months on something you're passionate about, even when you know people might judge you for how you look. Real strength is standing here with your head up when people are trying to tear you down." The gymnasium had grown quieter around them. Other students, parents, and teachers were beginning to notice the unusual scene unfolding in the back corner. "Now," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly across the space, "I'd like to hear Marcus tell me about his project, because I drove 3 hours to get here, and I'm very interested in learning about renewable energy from someone who clearly knows what he's talking about." Marcus looked up at his godfather, tears finally spilling over, but now they were tears of relief and gratitude rather than shame. It's a wind turbine," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "I built it to demonstrate how wind energy can be converted to electrical energy using a simple generator system." "That's incredible," Jake said, and his admiration was genuine. "Show me how it works." As Marcus began to explain his project, his confidence returning with each word, the group of bullies began to quietly disperse. But Jake wasn't done with them yet. "Wait," he called out, causing them to freeze. "I think you owe someone an apology." The students looked at each other, clearly hoping someone else would go first. Jake waited. Finally, Trevor Sullivan stepped forward. "Marcus, I'm sorry about what we said about your shoes. That was messed up." One by one, the others followed with mumbled apologies. They weren't perfect, and some were clearly more genuine than others. But Jake could see that Marcus appreciated the gesture. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly. As the group finally walked away, Jake turned his full attention to his godson and the remarkable project he'd created. But he also knew that this moment was about much more than a science fair or a group of bullies. It was about a promise he'd made 3 years ago and had almost broken. It was about remembering where he came from and who he really was beneath the fame and success. Most importantly, it was about making sure Marcus knew that he was never alone. No matter what anyone else might say or think, the real lesson was just beginning. The lesson. Word spread quickly through the Jefferson Middle School gymnasium that a professional UFC fighter was at the science fair. Parents began drifting toward the back corner where Jake stood with Marcus, their phones discreetly out, some recording video while pretending to examine nearby projects. But Jake's attention remained focused entirely on Marcus, who was now explaining his wind turbine project with growing confidence and enthusiasm. "The key innovation," Marcus was saying, "is in the gear ratio I designed. See, most simple turbines lose a lot of energy in the conversion process, but I used this pulley system to maximize the rotational speed transferred to the generator." "That's brilliant," Jake said, genuinely impressed. "Did you figure that out yourself?" "I researched it online and then tested different configurations," Marcus replied, beaming with pride. "It took me 17 tries to get the optimal ratio." Mrs. Patterson, the science teacher, had finally made her way over to see what the commotion was about. When she saw Jake's championship belt and noticed the respectful distance the other students were maintaining, she approached cautiously. "Is everything all right here?" she asked. "Everything's perfect," Jake replied with a warm smile. "I'm Jake Rodriguez, Marcus's godfather. I was just admiring his incredible project." "Oh," Mrs. Patterson's face lit up. "Marcus has been working so hard on this. He's one of our most dedicated students." "I can see that," Jake said. "The engineering here is really sophisticated. You've got yourself a future scientist, Mrs. Patterson. And thank you. I couldn't agree more." As they talked, Emma Rodriguez appeared at Jake's elbow. "Excuse me, Mr. Rodriguez," she said quietly. Jake looked down at the girl who'd sent him the message that brought him here. "You must be Emma. Thank you for reaching out. How did you know it was me?" "Lucky guess," Jake smiled. "Plus, you're the only kid here who doesn't look surprised to see me." Emma grinned. "I saw what was happening to Marcus, and I remembered seeing pictures of you two together on his mom's Facebook. I figured if anyone could help, it would be his UFC fighter godfather." Smart thinking, and good instincts about when someone needs backup. By now, a small crowd had gathered around Marcus's table. What had started as a humiliation was transforming into something entirely different. Students who had ignored Marcus before were now listening intently as he explained the environmental benefits of wind energy. Parents were asking questions about his research methods and congratulating him on his ingenuity. Trevor Sullivan approached hesitantly, his elaborate robotic arm project forgotten. "Marcus," he said, "I was wondering, could you help me understand how you calculated the optimal blade angle? My project has some mechanical components, but nothing as sophisticated as your gear system." Marcus looked surprised but pleased. "Sure, it's all about angular velocity and torque conversion." Jake watched with satisfaction as his godson fell into the role of teacher, explaining complex concepts with the passion of someone who truly understood his subject. This was the Marcus he remembered, brilliant, curious, and kind. You know, Jake said, raising his voice slightly so more people could hear. When I was Marcus's age, I got picked on a lot too. Different reasons, but the feeling was the same. A hush fell over the surrounding area as more students and parents turned to listen. I was angry all the time, Jake continued. Angry about being poor, angry about not having the things other kids had, angry about feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. That anger almost destroyed me. He looked around at the faces watching him, some curious, some skeptical, some clearly moved by his honesty. But I had someone who believed in me when nobody else did. Marcus's father, David Chen. He was my best friend, and he saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. He taught me that where you come from doesn't determine where you're going. Jake's voice grew stronger, more passionate. David died when Marcus was just 3 years old, he continued, but not before he made me promise to look out for his son. And I'm ashamed to say that I let fame and success make me forget that promise. I thought money and recognition made me better than where I came from. He looked directly at Marcus, who was listening with wide eyes. But watching what happened here today reminded me of something important. The most valuable things in life: intelligence, creativity, kindness, determination. Those things can't be bought. Marcus has all of those qualities, and he got them not despite his circumstances, but because of them. Jake lifted his championship belt for everyone to see clearly. This belt represents years of training, sacrifice, and fighting, but it's just a piece of metal and leather. What really matters is what I learned getting here, that real champions aren't made in expensive gyms or with fancy equipment. They're made by people who refuse to quit, who work harder than anyone expects, and who maintain their character even when others try to tear them down. The gymnasium had grown remarkably quiet. Even the youngest students seemed to understand they were witnessing something significant. Marcus, Jake said, turning back to his godson, I want you to know that I'm proud of you, not just for this amazing project, but for who you are. You're everything your father hoped you'd become. Marcus's eyes filled with tears again, but this time he didn't try to hide them. More importantly, Jake continued, I want everyone here to understand something. The next time you see someone wearing old clothes or shoes with holes in them, I want you to remember this moment. Remember that you might be looking at the kid who's going to cure cancer or solve climate change or create something that changes the world. He gestured toward Marcus's wind turbine, still spinning peacefully in its display. Real innovation doesn't come from privilege. It comes from necessity, from creativity, from the kind of resourcefulness you develop when you have to make something from nothing. Marcus built this entire project with spare parts and recycled materials. That's not a limitation, that's genius. Brittany Morrison, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. Mr. Rodriguez, she said quietly, I want to apologize again, not just to Marcus, but to you. What we did was awful. I appreciate that, Jake replied. But the person you need to convince isn't me. It's yourself. You need to decide what kind of person you want to be when nobody's watching. As the official judging began, Jake stayed by Marcus's side, asking questions and encouraging other visitors to learn about renewable energy. When the judges came to Marcus's table, they found a confident young scientist supported by his godfather, surrounded by interested peers, ready to share his passion for environmental solutions. 3 hours later, when Mrs. Patterson announced the winners, Marcus Chen took second place in the environmental science category. But more importantly, he was surrounded by new friends, genuine respect, and the knowledge that his work mattered. As they packed up the project together, Jake said, quietly, Marcus, I have something for you. He handed his godson a small wrapped package. Inside was a simple leather bracelet with a small metal plate engraved with the words, Real champions never quit, Dad and Uncle Jake. Your father and I used to say that to each other before every basketball game in high school, Jake explained. I had this made 3 years ago but never found the right time to give it to you. I think today is that time. Marcus fastened the bracelet around his wrist, his smile brighter than any LED on his wind turbine. Uncle Jake, he said, are you going to disappear again? Jake's heart clenched. No, champion. I'm done disappearing. In fact, I was thinking, maybe you and your mom would like to visit me in Vegas sometime. I could show you some of the training facilities, introduce you to some scientists who work on sports performance technology. Really? Really? And Marcus? I want you to know that you don't need anyone's permission to be brilliant. You don't need expensive clothes or perfect equipment. You just need to keep being exactly who you are. As they walked out of Jefferson Middle School together, Jake carrying Marcus's project and championship belt, Marcus wearing his new bracelet, and a confidence that would never be shaken again, other students and parents watched with a new understanding. Real strength, they had learned, wasn't about what you wore or where you came from. It was about standing up when others tried to knock you down. It was about believing in yourself when nobody else would. And sometimes it was about having someone who believed in you show up exactly when you needed them most. Behind them, Emma Rodriguez smiled as she packed up her own project. She'd started the day as just another student at the science fair. She ended it knowing she'd helped reunite a family and taught an entire school community about the difference between real value and superficial appearances. Sometimes the smallest actions created the biggest changes, and sometimes all it took was one message to the right person at exactly the right time. The end. This story demonstrates that true worth comes from character, determination, and authenticity, not from material possessions. It shows how one person's courage to stand up for others can create ripple effects that change entire communities, and how keeping promises to those we love can transform not just their lives, but our own.